When the night janitor at Fort Braxton finally broke her silence after 18 months of wordless work, her single command carried enough authority to make a 4-star general step back and obey without question. What happened in those crucial minutes would reveal a secret that no one at the base could have imagined about the quiet woman who had been invisibly cleaning their floors, preparing and narrating. This type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the sterile corridors of Fort Braxton's command center, casting harsh shadows across polished linoleum that reflected the institutional beige walls. It was 2:47 a.m., and the only sound echoing through the empty hallways was the rhythmic squeak of rubber wheels on Maria Santos's cleaning cart as she made her rounds through the most classified sections of the military installation. Her gray uniform hung loose on her small frame, the fabric worn thin from countless washings, and her steel-toed boots made barely a whisper against the floor as she moved with practiced efficiency through spaces that most people on the base would never see. Maria had been working the night shift at Fort Braxton for exactly 18 months, 2 weeks and 3 days. Not that anyone was counting, except for Maria herself, who had developed the habit of marking time in precise increments since arriving at the base. She was the kind of employee who seemed to blend into the background, invisible to the officers and enlisted personnel who hurried past her during the brief overlap periods when the day shift was ending and her nocturnal routine was beginning. To them, she was simply part of the infrastructure, as unremarkable as the security cameras or the climate control system that kept the sensitive equipment functioning properly. The personnel files listed her as Maria Santos, age 42, former custodial. Experience at civilian facilities, clean background check, no next of kin listed for emergency contact. What the files didn't mention was the way she moved through the building with an awareness that went beyond simple familiarity with the layout. Her dark eyes, partially hidden beneath the brim of a worn baseball cap, tracked every detail of her surroundings with the automatic precision of someone trained to notice things that others missed. She knew which fluorescent bulbs were beginning to flicker and would need replacement within the week. She knew which doors had hinges that squeaked just slightly when opened, indicating they hadn't been properly maintained. She knew the exact pattern of foot traffic through each corridor, the timing of security rounds, and the subtle changes in routine that might indicate something unusual was happening. The cleaning cart she pushed contained the expected array of supplies: industrial-strength disinfectant, microfiber cloths, trash bags, and a mop that had seen better days. But nestled between the bottles of cleaning solution and the rolls of paper towels were items that would have raised questions if anyone had bothered to look closely. A small first aid kit that contained supplies far more advanced than the standard bandages and antiseptic that most janitors might carry. A compact LED flashlight with a focused beam that could illuminate details in complete darkness. A multi-tool that included implements useful for more than just basic maintenance tasks. And tucked into the deep pocket of her uniform jacket, a small device that looked like an outdated cell phone but served a very different purpose. Maria's route took her through the administrative offices first, where she emptied waste baskets and wiped down surfaces that accumulated dust and fingerprints throughout the day. The offices were filled with the usual detritus of military bureaucracy: stacks of requisition forms, training schedules, personnel evaluations, and the endless stream of paperwork that kept the base functioning. She worked methodically, her movements economical and precise, never spending more time in any one location than necessary to complete her tasks. But her eyes continuously scanned the documents that crossed her path, reading and cataloging information with the automatic efficiency of someone who had been trained to extract intelligence from seemingly mundane sources. The command center was her next stop, a vast room filled with monitors, communication equipment, and workstations that coordinated operations across multiple time zones. During the day, the space buzzed with activity as officers and analysts monitored global situations and coordinated responses to developing crises. At night, it was staffed by a skeleton crew of watch officers who maintained situational awareness, while the regular day shift personnel were sleeping. Maria cleaned around them quietly, her presence so unremarkable that the night shift officers rarely acknowledged her existence beyond a brief nod. When she entered the room, she had learned to read the mood of the command center by observing details that most people would overlook. The number of coffee cups on the desks indicated how long the watch officers had been dealing with a particular situation. The types of maps displayed on the main screen suggested which regions were currently of greatest concern. The frequency of encrypted communications indicated the level of urgency surrounding various operations. Tonight, Maria noticed several indicators that suggested something significant was developing. Though the night shift personnel seemed unaware of the patterns she was observing. The secure briefing rooms were Maria's final stop before moving to the restricted areas that required special clearance to access. These were spaces where classified briefings were conducted, where sensitive intelligence was shared, and where decisions were made that could affect military operations around the world. The rooms were equipped with advanced security measures, designed to prevent electronic surveillance, but they couldn't prevent someone with the right training from observing and remembering details that might be significant. Maria cleaned these rooms with the same methodical precision she brought to every other task, but her attention to detail extended far beyond ensuring that the surfaces were properly disinfected. The restricted areas of the base were accessible only to personnel with specific security clearances, and Maria's cleaning duties required her to carry credentials that allowed her to move freely through spaces that were off-limits to most of the base population. She had undergone extensive background checks to obtain this access, checks that had revealed nothing suspicious about her previous employment or personal history. What the investigators hadn't discovered was that Maria's background had been carefully constructed to withstand exactly this type of scrutiny, created by people who understood how to hide important information in plain sight. As she worked her way through the restricted areas, Maria's trained eye noticed details that would have been invisible to most observers. The wear patterns on door handles that indicated which rooms were accessed more frequently than others. The placement of security cameras and the blind spots in their coverage. The locations of emergency exits and the procedures for accessing them during various types of crises. She absorbed this information automatically, filing it away in a mental database that had been developed through years of training and experience in environments where such knowledge could mean the difference between life and death. The most secure areas of the base were accessible only during specific hours and only with escort from authorized personnel. Maria's cleaning duties in these spaces were supervised by security officers who watched her work with the bored attention of people performing routine duties. They saw nothing unusual in her methodical approach to her tasks, nothing suspicious in the way she moved through the spaces with quiet efficiency. They didn't notice that she was memorizing the layout of rooms she might never see again, or that she was cataloging the types of equipment and documents that were stored in these most sensitive areas. By 4:30 a.m., Maria had completed her assigned rounds and was returning her cleaning cart to the storage area where it would remain until her next shift. She moved through the empty corridors with the same quiet precision she had maintained throughout the night, her presence as unremarkable as it had been when she began her work 6 hours earlier. To anyone who might have observed her routine, she appeared to be nothing more than a dedicated employee performing her duties with professional competence. But as Maria secured her cleaning supplies and prepared to leave the base, she paused for a moment to check the small device she carried in her jacket pocket. The display showed no new messages, no updates on the situations she had been monitoring through careful observation of the base's activities. For now, she would return to her small apartment off base, where she would spend the daylight hours, maintaining the careful facade of a civilian employee whose life revolved around her work schedule and little else. What no one at Fort Braxton knew was that Maria Santos had been waiting patiently for 18 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days for the right moment to emerge from the shadows where she had been carefully positioned. When that moment finally arrived, it would reveal that the quiet woman who cleaned their floors possessed knowledge and authority that would change everything about how they understood the world they thought they knew. Maria's apartment was a study in deliberate mediocrity, the kind of place that would pass any casual inspection without raising questions or leaving lasting impressions. The furniture was generic, purchased from discount stores with cash and assembled without care for aesthetic appeal. The walls were painted in neutral beige, unadorned except for a single framed photograph of a beach sunset that could have been taken anywhere in the world. The kitchen contained only the basic necessities: a coffee maker, a microwave, and a refrigerator stocked with simple meals that required minimal preparation. Anyone searching the apartment would find exactly what they expected to find in the home of a single woman working a night shift cleaning job. But hidden beneath the carefully constructed ordinariness were details that told a different story. The locks on the front door were commercial grade, far more sophisticated than what most tenants would install in a modest apartment complex. The windows were equipped with sensors that would detect any attempt at unauthorized entry devices, so small and expertly installed that they appeared to be decorative elements of the window frames. The bedroom closet contained uniforms and cleaning supplies, but also a small safe disguised as a jewelry box that held items no janitor would ever need to possess. Maria's daily routine followed a pattern that had been established during her first week at the apartment, designed to create the impression of a predictable lifestyle that would reassure any neighbors who might be paying attention. She arrived home from her shift at Fort Braxton at exactly 5:15 a.m., parking her aging Honda Civic in the same spot she had claimed since moving in. She collected her mail from the cluster of boxes near the apartment complex entrance, sorting through the bills and advertisements with the resigned efficiency of someone managing a tight budget. Her interactions with other residents were limited to polite nods and brief exchanges about the weather, conversations that revealed nothing about her background or interests. Once inside her apartment, Maria's demeanor shifted in ways that would have been imperceptible to casual observation, but significant to anyone trained in surveillance techniques. Her movements became more precise, her awareness more acute, as she conducted a routine security check that she had performed every morning for the past 18 months. She examined the small indicators she had placed throughout the apartment, invisible markers that would reveal if anyone had entered during her absence. She checked the devices that monitored the hallway outside her door, ensuring that no one had shown unusual interest in her comings and goings. Most importantly, she retrieved the secure communication device from its hiding place and checked for messages that might require her attention. The messages that appeared on the encrypted device were brief and coded, but Maria read them with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years communicating through similar channels. Intelligence reports from sources around the world, updates on situations that were developing beyond the awareness of conventional military channels, and occasionally, specific instructions that required careful consideration and precise execution. This morning's messages included routine updates on global situations, but also a priority communication that caused Maria to pause and read more carefully. The message was dated 3 hours earlier and originated from a source whose identity was known only through a coded designation that Maria recognized immediately. The content was brief but significant. Phoenix Protocol activation possible within 72 hours. Maintain readiness posture. Further instructions to follow. Maria read the message twice, memorizing every detail before initiating the sequence that would permanently delete it from the device. Phoenix Protocol was a designation she hadn't seen in over 2 years, a classification that indicated situations requiring the highest levels of operational security and the most carefully trained personnel. After securing her communication device, Maria followed the sleep schedule that had become routine since taking the night shift position at Fort Braxton. But her rest was different from the exhausted collapse that might be expected from someone who had spent 8 hours cleaning floors and emptying trash cans. Instead, she practiced the controlled relaxation techniques that had been drilled into her during training programs that officially didn't exist, methods that allowed her to achieve restorative sleep while maintaining this subconscious awareness that would alert her to any unusual sounds or activities in her environment. When Maria woke at 2 p.m., she began the afternoon routine that reinforced her cover identity, while simultaneously maintaining the skills that her true profession required. She prepared a simple meal and ate while reviewing local news broadcasts, paying particular attention to reports about regional military activities and any incidents that might have connections to the intelligence she had been monitoring. She conducted a physical fitness routine that appeared to be the basic exercises of someone trying to stay in shape on a limited budget, but was actually a carefully designed program that maintained the conditioning required for operations that might demand peak physical performance. The small home gym that Maria had assembled in her spare bedroom contained equipment that supported her cover story: a few dumbbells, an exercise mat, and a basic stationary bike that looked like it had been purchased used. But her workout routine revealed capabilities that extended far beyond what most people would develop through casual fitness activities. Her movements were precise and controlled, designed to maintain muscle memory for combat techniques while building the specific types of strength and endurance that might be needed in high-stress situations. She practiced forms that looked like basic stretching exercises but were actually training sequences for close-quarters combat, movements that kept her prepared for scenarios that she hoped would never occur. Maria's afternoon also included activities that reinforced her civilian identity while gathering information that might prove useful in her primary role. She made trips to local businesses, engaging in the mundane transactions that filled the lives of working-class residents while observing details that might be relevant to security assessments. She noted the patterns of traffic flow around the base, the types of vehicles that frequented certain areas, and the behavioral patterns of off-duty military personnel who lived in the surrounding community. This information was collected automatically, filed away in the same mental database that cataloged everything she observed during her night shifts at Fort Braxton. The grocery store where Maria shopped was frequented by military families and civilian employees who worked at the base, providing opportunities to observe conversations and behaviors that might reveal information about developing situations. She moved through the store with the same unremarkable efficiency that characterized her work as a janitor, but her trained ear caught fragments of conversations that others would dismiss as routine complaints about work schedules and family obligations. A wife mentioning that her husband's deployment had been extended without explanation. A teenager complaining that her father had been called in for unexpected duty assignments. A civilian contractor discussing changes to security protocols that had disrupted his normal access to certain areas of the base. These conversational fragments were meaningless to most listeners, but Maria understood how to piece together seemingly unrelated information to identify patterns that might indicate developing situations. The extension of deployment suggested operational tempo increases. Changes to security protocols indicated heightened threat assessments. Unexpected duty assignments implied that military leadership was preparing for situations that required additional personnel readiness. Individually, these indicators might represent routine fluctuations in military activities. Collectively, they suggested that something significant was developing. Maria's evening routine included activities that maintained her cover identity While preparing for the responsibilities that her true role might require, she prepared her work uniform with the careful attention to detail that characterized everything she did, ensuring that her appearance would support the unremarkable impression she had cultivated over the past 18 months. She reviewed the mental notes she had made during her previous shifts, updating her understanding of the base's activities and identifying areas that might require additional observation during her upcoming work period. The final element of Maria's preparation involved checking the secure communication device one more time before leaving for her night shift. This evening's messages included routine updates and one priority: communication that confirmed her earlier assessment of developing situations. The message was brief but unmistakable. Phoenix Protocol activation authorized. Stand by for specific instructions. Maintain current operational security. As Maria prepared to leave for another night of invisible work at Fort Braxton, she moved with the same unhurried efficiency that had characterized her routine for the past 18 months. To any observer, she appeared to be a dedicated employee, beginning another shift of cleaning floors and emptying trash cans. But beneath her unremarkable exterior, Maria Santos was preparing for the possibility that her carefully maintained cover identity might soon be tested in ways that would reveal capabilities that no one at the base could have imagined. The woman who would arrive at Fort Braxton in 30 minutes was far more than the sum of her janitorial duties. Though the full extent of her training and experience remained hidden beneath layers of operational security that had been constructed by people who understood the importance of having the right person in the right place when circumstances demanded immediate action from someone with very specific qualifications. The emergency alarm that pierced the night air at Fort Braxton at 11:47 p.m. was unlike anything the base had experienced in over a decade. Maria was midway through cleaning the third-floor administrative offices when the first klaxon sounded, its harsh electronic wail echoing through corridors that had been peaceful moments before. She froze in place, her trained instincts immediately cataloging the specific pattern of the alarm sequence. 3 long blasts followed by 2 short ones, repeated 3 times. Code black, security breach with active threat to personnel. Within seconds, the base's emergency lighting system activated, bathing the corridors in the red glow that indicated all non-essential personnel should immediately seek shelter in designated safe areas. Maria watched as the few night shift workers who had been moving through the halls suddenly shifted into emergency procedures, their casual conversations replaced by urgent movement toward the nearest secure locations. But instead of following the evacuation protocols that her janitorial position would normally require, Maria remained motionless, listening to the subtle differences in the alarm patterns that would tell her exactly what type of threat the base was facing. The second alarm sequence began before the first had completely faded, and Maria's expression hardened as she recognized the specific combination of signals. 4 short blasts, pause, 4 short blasts, pause, single long tone. Chemical threat detected. Potential contamination in progress. The implications hit her immediately. This wasn't a simple security breach or unauthorized personnel situation. Someone had introduced chemical agents into Fort Braxton's air handling system, turning the base's own infrastructure into a weapon against the people who worked there. Maria abandoned her cleaning cart and moved toward the nearest stairwell with the fluid precision of someone who had trained for exactly this type of emergency. But instead of descending toward the ground-level exits that other personnel were using, she climbed toward the 4th floor, where the base's environmental control systems were housed. Her movement through the emergency-lit stairwell was swift and purposeful, each step calculated to bring her closer to systems that most people on the base didn't even know existed. The 4th floor was restricted to authorized maintenance personnel and required special clearance to access. But Maria's janitorial credentials included permissions that had been carefully arranged to provide her with entry to areas that might prove crucial in emergency situations. She passed through the security checkpoint using the same unremarkable efficiency that characterized all her interactions with the base's systems. But her destination was far from routine. The environmental control room contained the computerized systems that regulated airflow, temperature, and atmospheric conditions throughout the entire facility. As Maria approached the control room, she could hear the urgent conversations of base personnel who were trying to coordinate their response to the unfolding crisis. The night shift security team was overwhelmed by the scope of the situation. Their training focused on conventional threats rather than the sophisticated chemical attack that was currently poisoning the base's air supply. Through the partly opened door of the security command center, Maria could see officers struggling with detection equipment that was providing contradictory readings, their voices carrying the strain of people who were facing a situation beyond their experience. The base's chemical detection systems were indicating the presence of multiple agents, but the readings were inconsistent and confusing. Some sensors showed high concentrations of airborne toxins, while others registered normal atmospheric conditions. The pattern suggested that whoever had introduced the chemical agents understood the base's detection systems well enough to exploit their vulnerabilities, creating a situation where the security team couldn't determine the exact nature of the threat they were facing. Maria paused outside the environmental control room, using her position to observe the activity in the adjacent command center while remaining invisible to the personnel who were focused on their emergency response procedures. What she saw confirmed her worst fears about the situation. The base's leadership was following standard protocols for chemical threats, but those protocols had been designed for conventional attacks using known agents delivered through predictable methods. The current situation involved sophisticated compounds that were being distributed through the base's own air handling systems, creating exposure patterns that the standard response procedures couldn't effectively address. From her vantage point, Maria could see the large status boards that displayed real-time information about the base's condition. The display showed a map of Fort Braxton with different areas highlighted in colors that indicated contamination levels and evacuation status. Red zones mark areas where chemical agents had been detected at dangerous concentrations. Yellow zones indicated areas where readings were inconclusive but potentially hazardous. Green zones showed areas that were currently considered safe for personnel. The pattern of contamination was spreading systematically through the base's ventilation systems, but not in the random distribution that would result from a simple release of chemical agents. Instead, the contamination was following specific pathways that suggested intimate knowledge of the base's infrastructure. Someone had studied Fort Braxton's environmental systems carefully enough to introduce chemical agents at precise locations, where they would be distributed most effectively throughout the facility. Maria's training allowed her to recognize details that were invisible to the security personnel who were managing the emergency response. The timing of the chemical release had been calculated to coincide with the night shift when the base's population was at its lowest, and the response capabilities were reduced. The selection of chemical agents created symptoms that would be difficult to diagnose quickly, buying time for the contamination to spread before effective countermeasures could be implemented. Most critically, the attack had been designed to overwhelm the base's standard response procedures, creating confusion that would prevent effective coordination of emergency actions. The base's medical facilities were already reporting an influx of personnel exhibiting symptoms consistent with chemical exposure. The symptoms were nonspecific but serious: respiratory distress, disorientation, and neurological effects that suggested exposure to compounds designed to incapacitate rather than kill immediately. The medical staff were following standard treatment protocols, but their efforts were being hampered by the fact that they couldn't identify the specific agents that had been used in the attack. Maria could see that the base's emergency response was entering a critical phase where standard Procedures were proving inadequate to address the scope and sophistication of the threat. The security teams were trained to handle conventional attacks, but they lacked the specialized knowledge required to counter chemical agents that had been engineered specifically to exploit vulnerabilities in the base's infrastructure. The medical personnel were skilled in treating conventional injuries and illnesses, but they were struggling to develop effective treatments for exposure to unknown chemical compounds. From her position outside the environmental control room, Maria watched as the base's senior leadership arrived to take command of the emergency response. Colonel James Mitchell, the base commander, entered the command center with his staff, their faces showing the strain of officers who were dealing with a situation that exceeded their training and experience. The conversation she could overhear through the partly open door revealed the magnitude of the crisis they were facing. The colonel was receiving briefings from multiple departments simultaneously, each providing information that painted a picture of an attack that had been planned and executed with military precision. The base's intelligence section reported that the chemical agents had been introduced through multiple access points, suggesting coordination by a team with detailed knowledge of Fort Braxton's security procedures. The medical section reported that the symptoms being exhibited by affected personnel were consistent with exposure to compounds that weren't found in any standard chemical weapons databases. Most disturbing was the report from the base's communication section, which revealed that the attack had included electronic components designed to disrupt the base's ability to request assistance from outside agencies. The communication systems were functional, but they were being jammed by signals that prevented clear transmission of emergency requests to higher headquarters and civilian emergency response organizations. Fort Braxton was effectively isolated, forced to handle the crisis with only the resources and personnel currently available on the base. As Maria listened to the briefings being delivered to Colonel Mitchell, she realized that the base's leadership was facing a situation that their standard operating procedures couldn't address. The chemical attack had been designed by someone who understood both the physical vulnerabilities of the base's infrastructure and the procedural limitations of its emergency response capabilities. The result was a crisis that was escalating beyond the ability of conventional military leadership to manage effectively. The time was approaching when Maria Santos would need to make a decision that would end 18 months of careful invisibility and reveal capabilities that had been hidden beneath her unremarkable exterior. The crisis at Fort Braxton required intervention from someone with very specific knowledge and training, someone who understood how to counter sophisticated chemical attacks and coordinate responses that went beyond standard military procedures. But making that decision would mean abandoning the carefully constructed identity that had protected her for the past 18 months and exposing herself to scrutiny that could have consequences extending far beyond the current emergency. The woman who cleaned floors and emptied trash cans was about to face a choice that would determine not only her own future, but the fate of everyone trapped inside Fort Braxton's contaminated walls. The crisis at Fort Braxton had reached the point where conventional solutions were failing, and Maria could see that the base's leadership was struggling with a situation that exceeded their training and experience. The chemical contamination was spreading through the ventilation systems faster than the security teams could track it, and the medical personnel were overwhelmed by casualties exhibiting symptoms that didn't match any known chemical agents. As she watched the emergency response deteriorate, Maria made a decision that would force her to abandon the invisibility that had protected her. For 18 months, she approached the security checkpoint outside the command center with the same unhurried efficiency that characterized all her movements, but her destination was far from routine. The guards at the checkpoint were focused on managing the flow of authorized personnel who were responding to the crisis, their attention divided between monitoring access controls and coordinating with the emergency response teams. When Maria appeared at their station, they barely looked up from their communication devices and status boards. "Ma'am, All non-essential personnel need to evacuate to the designated safe areas immediately, said Sergeant Williams, the senior guard at the checkpoint. His voice carried the automated tone of someone who had been repeating the same instruction for the past hour to civilian employees and support staff who were trying to access restricted areas during the emergency. The contamination is spreading, and we can't guarantee your safety in this section of the building. Maria stood quietly in front of the security station, her cleaning uniform and unremarkable appearance marking her as exactly the type of non-essential personnel who should be evacuating rather than trying to access the command center. She waited for Sergeant Williams to finish his radio communication before speaking, her voice calm and measured despite the chaos surrounding them. "Sergeant, I need to speak with Colonel Mitchell about the chemical contamination," Maria said, her words carrying none of the urgency that would normally accompany such a request. "I have information that might be relevant to the current situation." Sergeant Williams looked up from his communications equipment with the expression of someone who had been dealing with panicked civilians all night. His eyes took in Maria's gray uniform, her worn baseball cap, and the cleaning supplies visible on the cart she had abandoned nearby. The combination painted a picture of a janitor who had been caught up in the emergency and was now confused about proper evacuation procedures. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but the colonel is dealing with a serious security situation right now," Williams said with the patient tone used for addressing people who didn't understand the severity of the circumstances. "The best thing you can do is report to the safe area in Building C where the other civilian employees are waiting. Someone will brief you on the situation when it's appropriate." Maria remained standing at the checkpoint, her posture relaxed but her eyes focused on the activity visible through the command center's windows. She could see Colonel Mitchell receiving briefings from multiple departments, his staff struggling to coordinate responses to a crisis that was evolving faster than their procedures could handle. The chemical detection equipment was providing contradictory readings, the medical personnel were reporting increasing casualties, and the communication systems were being jammed by signals that prevented contact with outside assistance. "Sergeant, the chemical agents being used in this attack are designed to exploit vulnerabilities in the base's environmental control systems," Maria said, her voice remaining calm despite the urgency of the information she was trying to convey. "The contamination pattern suggests someone with detailed knowledge of Fort Braxton's infrastructure, and the standard response protocols won't be effective against this type of sophisticated attack." The words were delivered with the quiet authority of someone who understood exactly what she was discussing. But Sergeant Williams heard only a civilian employee who had been watching too many action movies and thought she understood military operations. His expression shifted from patience to mild irritation as he realized he was dealing with someone who was wasting his time during a genuine emergency. "Ma'am, I need you to understand that we're dealing with a real threat here, not something from television," Williams said, his voice carrying the condescending tone used for people who were interfering with important work. "The colonel has experts advising him on chemical threats, and they don't need input from cleaning staff. Please report to the evacuation area immediately." Behind Williams, his partner Corporal Jackson was monitoring the communications from the command center, his attention focused on the increasingly desperate reports from the teams trying to contain the contamination. The medical section was reporting that standard treatments weren't effective against the chemical agents, and the environmental control teams were struggling to isolate the contamination sources. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, but the guards at the checkpoint were too focused on their immediate responsibilities to recognize that the woman standing in front of them might have information that could save lives. Maria could see past the checkpoint to where Colonel Mitchell was receiving another briefing from his intelligence officer, the contents of which were clearly adding to the base commander's growing concern about the situation. The chemical attack had been executed with precision that suggested military training and access to classified information about the base's vulnerabilities. The standard response procedures were proving inadequate, and the base's leadership was facing the possibility that conventional military solutions might not be sufficient to address the threat. Sergeant, the jamming signals being used to disrupt communications are synchronized with the chemical release patterns, Maria continued, her voice maintaining the same calm tone, despite the obvious frustration of the guards who were trying to dismiss her. This level of coordination indicates a team with specialized training in chemical warfare and electronic countermeasures. The attack was designed to overwhelm standard military response capabilities. Sergeant Williams stood up from his station. His body language shifted into the more aggressive posture used for dealing with people who were becoming problematic during emergency situations. The combination of Maria's persistent presence and her detailed knowledge of the attack was beginning to register as suspicious rather than helpful, and his training emphasized the importance of maintaining security protocols, even when dealing with apparently harmless civilians. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one more time to report to the evacuation area," Williams said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who is prepared to enforce his instructions if necessary. "If you have information about this attack, you can report it to the debriefing teams after the situation is resolved. Right now, you're interfering with emergency operations, and I have the authority to detain you if you don't comply with evacuation orders." The threat of detention was delivered with the routine efficiency of someone who had been trained to handle uncooperative civilians during crisis situations. From Williams' perspective, Maria was simply another confused employee who had been caught up in events beyond her understanding and was now trying to inject herself into military operations where she didn't belong. The fact that her observations about the attack were accurate was lost in the context of her unremarkable appearance and civilian status. Maria accepted the rejection with the same quiet dignity that characterized all her interactions with base personnel. She nodded once to acknowledge Williams' instructions, then turned away from the checkpoint without argument or protest. Her movement back toward the evacuation route was unhurried and compliant, giving no indication that she was frustrated or disappointed by the dismissal. As she walked away from the security checkpoint, Maria passed other civilian employees who were being directed toward the safe areas by military personnel who were focused on clearing non-essential personnel from the operational areas. The evacuation was proceeding according to established procedures, but Maria could see that the emergency response was failing to address the sophisticated nature of the threat. The chemical contamination was spreading faster than the security teams could contain it, and the medical personnel were struggling to treat casualties without knowing the specific agents that had been used in the attack. The dismissal from the checkpoint was exactly what Maria had expected based on her 18 months of careful observation of the base's personnel and procedures. Military organizations were designed to function through established chains of command and recognized areas of expertise, and a janitor asking to speak with the base commander during a crisis would naturally be viewed as interference rather than assistance. The fact that she possessed knowledge and training that could address the current situation was irrelevant in the context of her official position and unremarkable appearance. But as Maria moved toward the evacuation area with the other civilian employees, she was already calculating the time remaining before the chemical contamination would reach critical levels throughout the base. The standard response procedures were buying time, but they weren't addressing the root causes of the attack or the sophisticated methods being used to distribute the chemical agents. Soon, the crisis would reach a point where conventional military leadership would be forced to acknowledge that their expertise was insufficient to handle the situation. When that moment arrived, Maria Santos would be ready to emerge from the invisibility that had protected her for 18 months and reveal capabilities that no one at Fort Braxton could have imagined. But for now, she would wait with the patience of someone who understood that the right moment for action was more important than the urgent desire to help people who were suffering from problems they couldn't solve on their own. The evacuation area in Building C was a study in controlled chaos, filled with civilian employees and non-essential personnel who had been cleared from the operational areas of Fort Braxton. The large conference room had been hastily converted into a temporary shelter, with folding chairs arranged in rows and military personnel stationed at the entrances to manage the flow of people seeking safety from the chemical contamination. Maria took a seat near the back of the room, her presence as unremarkable among the evacuated civilians as it had been during her 18 months of night shift work. The atmosphere in the evacuation area was tense with the kind of nervous energy that accompanies situations where people understand they are in danger but have no control over the circumstances. Conversations were conducted in hushed tones, with civilian employees sharing incomplete information about the crisis and speculating about the nature of the threat they were facing. The military personnel managing the evacuation provided reassuring platitudes about the situation being under control, but their body language suggested they were as concerned about the developing crisis as the civilians they were supposed to be protecting. Maria listened to the conversations around her with the same careful attention she brought to all her observations, but her focus was primarily on the radio communications that were crackling through the military personnel's equipment. The reports from the operational areas were increasingly urgent, with emergency response teams struggling to contain chemical contamination that was spreading faster than their countermeasures could address. The medical section was reporting casualties that exceeded their treatment capacity, and the environmental control teams were unable to isolate the sources of the chemical agents. Near the front of the evacuation area, Lieutenant Colonel Chen was coordinating with the base's emergency response teams while simultaneously managing the civilian personnel who had been cleared from the operational areas. Chen was the base's deputy commander for operations, a position that required her to understand both the tactical aspects of military operations and the administrative complexities of managing a large installation. Her background included advanced training in chemical warfare and counterterrorism, qualifications that made her one of the few people at Fort Braxton who understood the full implications of the current crisis. As Chen monitored the radio communications from the command center, her trained ear caught details that revealed the sophisticated nature of the attack. The chemical agents were being distributed through multiple vectors simultaneously, creating contamination patterns that suggested coordination by a team with detailed knowledge of the base's infrastructure. The electronic jamming was disrupting communications with outside agencies, preventing requests for specialized assistance from military units trained to handle chemical threats. Most critically, the attack had been timed to coincide with the night shift when the base's response capabilities were reduced, and the population was concentrated in areas that would maximize the effectiveness of airborne contaminants. Chen's analysis of the situation was interrupted by a radio communication from the command center that carried the unmistakable tone of desperation. The base's chemical detection equipment was providing contradictory readings that prevented the emergency response teams from determining the exact nature of the threat they were facing. The standard treatment protocols were proving ineffective against the chemical agents, and the medical personnel were struggling to develop alternative approaches without knowing the specific compounds involved in the attack. Colonel Chen, we need your assessment of the chemical threat, came the voice of Major Rodriguez, the base's intelligence officer, through the radio. The detection equipment is showing multiple agents, but the readings are inconsistent. We're not sure if we're dealing with a cocktail of known compounds, or something that's been specifically engineered to confuse our sensors. Chen keyed her radio to respond, but before she could speak, she heard a quiet voice from the back of the evacuation area that provided exactly the information Rodriguez was requesting. The voice belonged to Maria Santos, the night shift janitor who had been dismissed from the command center checkpoint 30 minutes earlier. The inconsistent readings are intentional, Maria said, her voice carrying clearly through the conference room despite its quiet tone. The chemical agents include masking compounds designed to interfere with standard detection equipment. The attack is using a binary system where harmless components become toxic when they combine in the base's air handling systems. Chen turned toward the source of the voice, her eyes scanning the rows of civilian employees until she located Maria sitting near the back of the room. The woman's appearance was unremarkable: gray uniform, worn baseball cap, the tired expression of someone who had been working night shifts for months. But her words demonstrated knowledge of chemical warfare techniques that far exceeded what any civilian employee should possess. The electronic jamming is synchronized with the chemical release patterns, Maria continued, her tone remaining calm and professional despite the urgent nature of the information she was providing. The attack was designed to overwhelm standard military response protocols by creating multiple simultaneous threats that exceed the base's normal response capabilities. Chen stood and walked toward Maria, her movement drawing the attention of the other military personnel in the evacuation area. The lieutenant colonel's approach was measured but purposeful, carrying the authority of someone who had recognized information that could be crucial to resolving the crisis. The conversations in the conference room quieted as other people noticed the interaction developing between the deputy commander and the woman who appeared to be just another civilian employee. "Ma'am, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Chen," she said, stopping directly in front of Maria's chair. "I'd like to know how you're familiar with binary chemical systems and electronic warfare techniques." Maria looked up at Chen with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the crisis, but something in her eyes suggested that the question had been expected. The 18 months of invisibility were approaching their end, and the moment when her carefully constructed cover identity would need to be abandoned was arriving faster than she had anticipated. "I've had some experience with chemical threats," Maria replied, her voice carrying the understated tone that military personnel used when discussing classified background information. The attack pattern suggests someone with military training and access to classified information about the base's vulnerabilities. Chen's expression shifted as she processed the implications of Maria's response. The woman's knowledge of chemical warfare techniques was too detailed and specific to have been acquired through civilian channels, and her calm demeanor during the crisis suggested training in emergency response procedures that far exceeded what any civilian employee would possess. Most significantly, her analysis of the attack was more comprehensive and accurate than the assessments being provided by the base's intelligence and chemical warfare specialists. "What kind of experience?" Chen asked, her tone shifting to the more formal register used for official inquiries. "And how do you know about the electronic jamming and binary systems?" Maria stood slowly, her movement deliberate and controlled as she prepared to abandon the cover identity that had protected her for 18 months. The conference room had become quiet as the other evacuated personnel recognized that something significant was happening, though they couldn't understand the nature of the interaction they were witnessing. "Lieutenant Colonel, I believe I can provide assistance with the current situation," Maria said, her voice carrying a subtle but unmistakable change in tone that suggested military training and operational experience. "But I'll need to discuss my background privately before we proceed." Chen studied Maria's face with the trained eye of someone who had learned to read people during years of military service. The woman's calm confidence during the crisis, her detailed knowledge of chemical warfare techniques, and her careful phrasing when discussing her background all suggested that there was far more to Maria Santos than her janitorial position would indicate. "Sergeant Murphy," Chen called to one of the military personnel managing the evacuation area, "I need you to maintain order here while I conduct a brief interview with this civilian employee." Chen gestured toward a smaller conference room adjacent to the main evacuation area, her movement indicating that Maria should follow her. As they walked toward the private space, Chun's radio crackled with another urgent communication from the command center. The chemical contamination was reaching critical levels in multiple areas of the base, and the emergency response teams were running out of options for containing the threat. Colonel Chen, we need that chemical assessment immediately, Major. Rodriguez's voice carried the strain of someone who was facing a situation that exceeded his training and experience. The medical section is reporting casualties that they can't treat effectively, and the environmental control teams are unable to isolate the contamination sources. Chen looked at Maria as they entered the smaller conference room, her expression showing the calculation of someone who was weighing risks and potential benefits. The base's crisis was escalating beyond the ability of conventional military response to address, and the woman standing in front of her might possess knowledge that could save lives. Ma'am, I think it's time for you to tell me exactly who you are and what kind of experience you have with chemical warfare, Chen said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who was prepared to make decisions that could affect the fate of everyone trapped inside Fort Braxton's contaminated walls. Maria Santos looked directly at Lieutenant Colonel Chen, her expression calm but resolute as she prepared to reveal capabilities that had been hidden beneath 18 months of invisible service. The moment had arrived when her carefully maintained cover would need to be abandoned, and the consequences of that decision would extend far beyond the current crisis. In the privacy of the smaller conference room, Maria Santos reached into the deep pocket of her uniform jacket and withdrew a small leather wallet that she had never shown to anyone at Fort Braxton during her 18 months of employment. The wallet contained identification documents that bore her photograph and name, but the seals and insignia were unlike anything Lieutenant Colonel Chen had seen on standard military or civilian credentials. The primary document was printed on specialized paper with security features that indicated classification levels far above what most military personnel would ever encounter. Chen examined the identification with the careful attention of someone who had been trained to recognize authentic documents from sophisticated forgeries. The credentials identified Maria Santos as a Special Operations Chemical Warfare Specialist. Classification Level Echo 7. Assigned to a unit designation that Chen had heard mentioned only in classified briefings about counter-terrorism operations. The authorization codes and security clearances listed on the documents exceeded Chen's own access levels, indicating that the woman she had dismissed as a civilian janitor possessed qualifications that placed her among the most highly trained specialists in the military. Colonel Maria Santos, United States Army Chemical Corps, Special Operations Division, Maria said, her voice carrying the precise pronunciation of someone stating her official identity after months of maintaining a false persona. I've been assigned to Fort Braxton under deep cover protocols to monitor potential chemical threats and assess the base's vulnerability to the type of attack that is currently in progress. Chen's expression shifted from confusion to understanding as she processed the implications of Maria's revelation. The woman's detailed knowledge of chemical warfare techniques, her calm demeanor during the crisis, and her accurate assessment of the attack patterns suddenly made perfect sense. She wasn't a civilian employee who had accidentally acquired specialized knowledge. She was a military professional who had been deliberately positioned to respond to exactly the type of threat that was now threatening the base. The binary chemical system being used in this attack is designated Agent Nemesis, Maria continued, her voice carrying the technical precision of someone briefing on classified weapon systems. It's a two-component system where harmless precursor chemicals become highly toxic when they combine in specific ratios. The attack was designed to exploit vulnerabilities in Fort Braxton's air handling systems that were identified during a classified assessment conducted 18 months ago. Chen's radio crackled with another urgent communication from the command center, where the situation was continuing to deteriorate. The chemical contamination had reached critical levels in multiple areas of the base, and the emergency response Teams were struggling with detection equipment that continued to provide contradictory readings. The medical section was reporting casualties that exceeded their treatment capacity, with symptoms that didn't respond to standard chemical exposure protocols. Colonel Santos, can you provide immediate assistance with the current situation? Shun asked, her tone shifting to the formal register used for communications between military officers of equal rank. The base's emergency response teams are overwhelmed, and we need someone with your expertise to coordinate countermeasures. Maria nodded once, her movement carrying the decisive authority of someone who had been waiting for this moment throughout the crisis. She retrieved a secure communication device from another pocket of her uniform, a piece of equipment that bore no resemblance to the standard military radios used by base personnel. The device was smaller and more sophisticated than anything Chen had seen, with displays and controls that suggested capabilities far beyond routine communication functions. This is Colonel Santos, authorization code Phoenix 77 Alpha. Maria spoke into the device, her voice carrying the crisp professionalism of someone accessing classified communication channels. I need immediate activation of Nemesis. Countermeasure protocols for Fort Braxton. Priority Alpha authorization, full spectrum response. The response from the device was immediate and came in the form of a synthesized voice that provided information with the efficiency of automated systems designed for emergency situations. Colonel Santos, Phoenix protocols activated. Nemesis countermeasure database accessed. Uploading current tactical assessment and response procedures to your device. Estimated completion time, 30 seconds. Shun watched in amazement as Maria's communication device displayed detailed technical information about the chemical agents being used in the attack, including molecular structures, detection parameters, and specific countermeasure procedures that weren't available in any standard military database. The information was being transmitted in real time from sources that had access to classified intelligence about chemical weapon systems that officially didn't exist. Lieutenant Colonel Chen, I need you to patch me through to the command center. Immediately, Maria said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had taken command of the situation. The emergency response teams are using procedures that won't be effective against Agent Nemesis, and we need to implement countermeasures before the contamination reaches lethal concentrations. Shun activated her radio and contacted the command center, her voice carrying the urgency of someone who had received critical information that could change the outcome of the crisis. Command Center, this is Lieutenant Colonel Chen. I have a chemical warfare specialist who needs to speak with Colonel Mitchell immediately. This is Priority Alpha. Repeat, Priority Alpha. The response from the command center was immediate, with Colonel Mitchell's voice coming through the radio with the strained tone of someone who was facing a situation that exceeded his training and experience. Chen, we don't have time for additional briefings. The situation is critical, and we need solutions, not more analysis. Colonel Mitchell, this is Colonel Santos, Maria said, taking the radio from Chen with the smooth efficiency of someone accustomed to assuming command during emergency situations. I'm a chemical warfare specialist who has been monitoring the base's vulnerability to Agent Nemesis attacks. The countermeasures you're currently implementing won't be effective against this specific chemical system. The radio went silent for several seconds before Mitchell's voice returned, carrying a tone of confusion and growing hope. Colonel Santos, I don't have any record of a chemical warfare specialist assigned to Fort Braxton. What's your unit designation? And how do you know about Agent Nemesis? Colonel, I'm operating under special operations protocols that require deep cover placement. Maria replied, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone used for discussing classified operations. Agent Nemesis is a binary chemical system that requires specific neutralization procedures. The standard countermeasures are not only ineffective, they actually accelerate the toxic reaction when the precursor chemicals combine. Through the radio, Chen could hear the activity in the command center changing as Maria's words were processed by the emergency response teams. The revelation that their countermeasures were potentially making the situation worse created a new level of urgency that transcended the confusion about Maria's identity and qualifications. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Colonel Santos, what do you need from us? Mitchell asked, his voice carrying the decisive tone of someone who was prepared to authorize whatever actions were necessary to resolve the crisis. Our people are dying, and if you have solutions, we need to implement them immediately. Maria consulted the information on her secure communication device, her trained eye quickly processing the technical data that had been transmitted from classified sources. The countermeasure procedures for Agent Nemesis were complex and required coordination between multiple departments, but they were within the capabilities of Fort Braxton's personnel if they were implemented correctly. Colonel Mitchell, I need you to immediately cease all current air handling system operations, Maria said, her voice carrying the clear authority of someone providing life or death instructions. The circulation systems are distributing the chemical agents throughout the base. We need to implement containment procedures before we can begin neutralization. The command center erupted in activity as Mitchell's staff began implementing Maria's instructions. The emergency response teams that had been struggling with ineffective countermeasures suddenly had clear direction from someone who understood the specific nature of the threat they were facing. The change in the command center's atmosphere was audible through the radio, with the desperate confusion of the past hour being replaced by the focused efficiency of military personnel executing a clear mission. Environmental control teams, cease all ventilation operations immediately. Mitchell's voice carried over the radio as he coordinated the implementation of Maria's instructions. Medical section, prepare for administration of Nemesis Pacific antidotes. Intelligence section, coordinate with Colonel Santos for tactical assessment updates. Maria continued providing detailed instructions to the emergency response teams, her knowledge of Agent Nemesis and its countermeasures enabling her to coordinate a response that addressed the specific characteristics of the chemical attack. The binary nature of the system required neutralization procedures that were completely different from standard chemical warfare protocols, and her expertise was the key to implementing countermeasures that could save the lives of everyone trapped inside Fort Braxton's contaminated walls. As the base's emergency response teams began implementing Maria's countermeasures, Lieutenant Colonel Chen watched in amazement as the woman she had known as a night shift janitor revealed capabilities that exceeded anything she had imagined. The quiet efficiency that had characterized Maria's cleaning duties had been transformed into the decisive leadership of a military professional who was trained to handle the most sophisticated chemical threats in the world. Within minutes of Maria's intervention, the command center began reporting success with the countermeasure procedures. The chemical detection equipment was providing clearer readings as the neutralization process began to take effect, and the medical section was REPOR-TING improved responses to the specialized treatment protocols that Maria had provided. The crisis that had overwhelmed Fort Braxton's standard emergency response capabilities was being resolved by someone who had been invisible among them for 18 months. The success of Maria's countermeasures in neutralizing the Agent Nemesis attack was short-lived, interrupted by a new alarm sequence that sent a chill through the command center personnel, who had just begun to believe the crisis was under control. The electronic warning system activated with a pattern that none of the base's emergency response teams had heard before. 5 long blasts followed by a rapid succession of short tones, repeated in a sequence that indicated a threat classification beyond the standard protocols that Fort Braxton's personnel had been trained to handle. Maria's secure communication device began displaying priority alerts from classified monitoring systems that were tracking developing situations around the Globe. The information appearing on her screen confirmed her worst fears about the true scope of the attack on Fort Braxton. The chemical assault had been merely the opening phase of a coordinated operation designed to test the base's response capabilities and identify vulnerabilities that could be exploited in a much larger strike. Colonel Mitchell, the Agent Nemesis. Attack was a probe, Maria said into her radio, her voice carrying the grim certainty of someone who had access to intelligence that painted a far more dangerous picture than the crisis they had just survived. The attackers were testing our countermeasures and response times. The real assault is about to begin, and it's going to involve weapon systems that are classified beyond anything your personnel have been trained to handle. The command center's atmosphere shifted from relief to renewed tension as Mitchell's staff processed the implications of Maria's warning. The chemical attack that had overwhelmed their standard emergency procedures had been nothing more than a preliminary test, designed to gather information about the base's capabilities and vulnerabilities. The enemy forces responsible for the assault possessed intelligence about Fort Braxton's infrastructure and response protocols that suggested inside knowledge of the base's operations. Through her secure communication device, Maria was receiving real-time intelligence updates about the coordinated attack that was developing against multiple military installations across the region. Fort Braxton was the primary target, but the assault involved synchronized strikes against communication centers, supply depots, and command facilities that would cripple the military's ability to respond effectively to the main assault. The sophistication of the operation indicated state-level sponsorship and resources that far exceeded the capabilities of terrorist organizations. Colonel Santos were detecting multiple aircraft approaching from the southeast. Came the urgent report from the base's air defense section. The radar signatures don't match any known aircraft in our identification databases, and they're not responding to radio communications. Estimated time to target, 12 minutes. Maria consulted the tactical information on her device, cross-referencing the approaching aircraft with classified databases that contained information about experimental weapon systems and prototype vehicles that were still in development phases. What she found confirmed that Fort Braxton was facing an assault involving technology that was years ahead of the countermeasures that conventional military forces had been trained to deploy. Colonel Mitchell, the aircraft approaching the base are equipped with electromagnetic pulse weapons designed to disable our electrical systems, Maria reported, her voice maintaining the calm professionalism that had characterized her crisis management throughout the night. The pulse weapons are followed by deployment of advanced chemical agents that are designed to be lethal, even with the countermeasures we just implemented. The revelation that the approaching aircraft possessed weapon systems that could neutralize the base's electrical infrastructure created a new level of urgency in the command center. The emergency response teams that had successfully countered the Agent Nemesis attack were now facing the prospect of operating without power, communications, or electronic systems while defending against chemical weapons that were more sophisticated than anything they had encountered before. Maria's secure communication device was displaying deployment options for advanced countermeasures that were available through classified channels, but implementing them would require her to reveal the full extent of her operational capabilities and the resources that were available to personnel operating under deep cover protocols. The decision to access these systems would end any possibility of returning to her invisibility as a night shift janitor and would expose her to scrutiny that could compromise other operations that were being conducted under similar cover arrangements. Colonel Mitchell, I can coordinate countermeasures against the electromagnetic pulse weapons and the advanced chemical agents, Maria said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who was about to make a decision that would have consequences extending far beyond the current crisis. But implementing these countermeasures will require me to access classified systems that will reveal the full scope of the operations that have been conducted from this base. The command center became quiet as Mitchell processed the implications of Maria's offer. The base commander understood that he was being asked to authorize actions that would expose classified operations and potentially compromise ongoing intelligence activities. But the alternative was facing an assault that would overwhelm Fort Braxton's conventional defenses and result in casualties that could include everyone currently trapped on the base. Colonel Santos, what are the potential consequences of implementing these countermeasures? Mitchell asked, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone who was weighing immediate survival against long-term operational security. And what kind of resources are we talking about accessing? Maria looked at Lieutenant Colonel Chen, who was monitoring the conversation with the growing understanding that the woman she had known as a night shift janitor was connected to operations that operated at classification levels far above anything she had encountered in her military career. The revelation that Fort Braxton had been host to deep cover operations involving weapon systems and countermeasures that exceeded conventional military capabilities was reshaping Chun's understanding of the base's true purpose. Colonel Mitchell, the countermeasures I can access involve electromagnetic hardening systems that will protect the base's infrastructure from pulse weapons, Maria explained, her voice carrying the technical precision of someone briefing on classified defense systems. The chemical countermeasures include deployment of neutralizing agents that are specific to the advanced compounds that will be used in the assault. But accessing these systems will reveal that Fort Braxton has been serving as a testing ground for experimental defense technologies. The approaching aircraft were now visible on the base's radar systems, their flight patterns indicating coordinated attack formations that were designed to overwhelm the base's air defenses through synchronized strikes from multiple directions. The electromagnetic pulse weapons they carried would disable the base's electrical systems within minutes of deployment, leaving the personnel defenseless against the chemical weapons that would follow. Maria's communication device was displaying countdown timers that tracked the approaching aircraft and the time remaining before the electromagnetic pulse weapons would be within effective range of the base's infrastructure. The decision about whether to implement the advanced countermeasures needed to be made within the next few minutes, and the consequences of that decision would affect not only the immediate survival of Fort Braxton's personnel but also the future of classified operations that were being conducted at military installations around the world. Colonel Santos, we need to make a decision immediately, Mitchell said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who is prepared to accept responsibility for actions that exceeded his normal authorization levels. If you can save the lives of the people on this base, then we need to implement whatever countermeasures are available, regardless of the consequences for ongoing operations. Maria nodded once, her movement carrying the finality of someone who was about to abandon the careful invisibility that had protected her for 18 months and reveal capabilities that would place her at the center of investigations that could last for years. The woman who had cleaned floors and emptied trash cans was about to become the focal point of defense operations involving technology that most military personnel didn't know existed. Colonel Mitchell, I'm activating Phoenix Protocol countermeasures, Maria said, her voice carrying the decisive authority of someone who had made a choice that would determine the fate of everyone trapped inside Fort Braxton's walls. I need you to clear all personnel from the base's power generation facilities and communication centers. The electromagnetic hardening systems will require complete shutdown of all electrical systems for 90 seconds during the activation process. The command center erupted in activity as Mitchell's staff began implementing Maria's instructions, coordinating the evacuation of personnel from areas that would be affected by the countermeasure deployment. The base's emergency response teams that had struggled with the Agent Nemesis attack were now preparing to defend against weapon systems that represented the cutting edge of military technology, guided by someone whose qualifications exceeded Anything they had imagined possible. As the countdown timers on Maria's device approached 0, indicating that the electromagnetic pulse weapons were nearly within range, she prepared to reveal the full extent of the defensive capabilities that had been secretly installed at Fort Braxton during her 18 months of invisible service. The quiet janitor who had been dismissed and ignored was about to demonstrate that she possessed the authority and resources to coordinate defense operations that would protect everyone on the base from an assault that conventional military forces couldn't have survived. The decision to implement the Phoenix protocol countermeasures would end Maria Santos's career as an invisible observer and transform her into the central figure in a crisis that would test the most advanced military technology in the world. But the alternative was allowing everyone at Fort Braxton to die from weapons that had been specifically designed to overwhelm conventional military defenses. Maria's fingers moved across the secure communication device with the practiced efficiency of someone who had trained for this exact scenario, accessing defense systems that had been secretly integrated into Fort Braxton's infrastructure. During her 18 months of invisible service, the device's screen displayed a complex array of controls and status indicators that revealed the true purpose of many routine maintenance projects that had been conducted at the base over the past year and a half. What appeared to be standard electrical upgrades and communication system improvements had actually been the installation of experimental defense technologies that were years ahead of anything available to conventional military forces. Phoenix protocol activation confirmed, came the synthesized voice from her device as security locks disengaged and classified systems came online throughout the base. Electromagnetic hardening systems ready for deployment. Chemical neutralization systems standing by. All personnel must be clear of designated areas within 60 seconds for successful countermeasure implementation. The command center became a focal point of coordinated activity as Colonel Mitchell's staff implemented the evacuation procedures that Maria had specified. Personnel were being cleared from the base's power generation facilities, communication centers, and air handling systems that would be affected by the Phoenix protocol deployment. The complexity of the evacuation revealed the extent to which Fort Braxton's infrastructure had been modified to support defensive capabilities that exceeded anything the base's official personnel had been trained to operate. Through the command center's windows, Maria could see the approaching aircraft as dark shapes against the night sky, their unconventional designs confirming that they were equipped with experimental weapon systems that represented the cutting edge of military technology. The electromagnetic pulse weapons they carried would normally disable every electronic system on the base within seconds of deployment, leaving the personnel defenseless against the chemical weapons that would follow. But Fort Braxton was no longer a conventional military installation. All personnel report clear of designated areas, came the urgent communication from the base's security teams. Power generation facilities evacuated, communication centers secured. Air handling systems isolated, standing by for countermeasure deployment. Maria consulted the tactical display on her device, which showed the approaching aircraft had reached the optimal range for electromagnetic pulse weapon deployment. The timing of the Phoenix protocol activation would need to be precise, with the hardening systems engaging at the exact moment the pulse weapons were fired. Too early, and the base's power systems would be vulnerable during the recharge cycle. Too late, and the electromagnetic pulse would disable the countermeasures before they could be fully deployed. Phoenix protocol electromagnetic hardening systems activating in 10 seconds, Maria announced over the base's communication system, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had rehearsed this procedure countless times during classified training exercises. All personnel maintain positions and prepare for brief power interruption. Countermeasure deployment will last 90 seconds. The first indication that the electromagnetic pulse weapons had been fired came not from the base's detection systems, but from the subtle change in atmospheric pressure that preceded the arrival of the electromagnetic wave. Maria felt the familiar tingling sensation that indicated exposure to intense electromagnetic fields, but instead of the catastrophic system failures that should have followed, Fort Braxton's electrical infrastructure remained stable and functional. Phoenix Protocol hardening systems had created an electromagnetic barrier around the base that absorbed and dissipated the pulse weapon energy, protecting the critical systems that would be needed to defend against the chemical weapons that were already being deployed by the attacking aircraft. The lights in the command center flickered momentarily as the systems cycled through their protective protocols, but the base's power generation and communication capabilities remained intact. Electromagnetic pulse countermeasures successful. Maria reported to Colonel Mitchell, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had successfully implemented technology that performed exactly as designed. Chemical neutralization systems now deploying. All personnel should remain in secure areas until the neutralization process is complete. The attacking aircraft were now releasing their chemical payloads, deploying agents that were designed to be lethal even with the countermeasures that had been effective against Agent Nemesis. The compounds being dispersed through the air were more sophisticated than anything that had been used in previous attacks, with molecular structures that had been engineered to defeat standard chemical defense systems. But the Phoenix Protocol included countermeasures that had been specifically designed to neutralize these advanced chemical weapons. Throughout Fort Braxton, automated systems that had been disguised as routine maintenance equipment began releasing neutralizing agents into the atmosphere. The chemicals that were being deployed by the attacking aircraft were being met by countermeasures that had been calculated to react with the specific molecular structures of the weapons, creating harmless compounds that would dissipate without affecting the base's personnel. The process was invisible to most observers, but the results were measurable through the chemical detection systems that showed the dangerous agents being neutralized before they could reach lethal concentrations. Chemical neutralization systems operating at full effectiveness, Maria reported, monitoring the tactical displays that showed the countermeasures successfully protecting the base from the advanced chemical weapons. Hostile aircraft withdrawing from the area. Threat assessment shows minimal residual contamination. The success of the Phoenix Protocol countermeasures had saved everyone at Fort Braxton from an assault that would have been devastating to conventional military forces. But the implementation of the classified defense systems had also revealed the true nature of the operations that had been conducted at the base, exposing Maria's role in activities that were supposed to remain invisible to military personnel who lacked appropriate security clearances. Colonel Mitchell's voice came through the communication system with the relief of someone who had witnessed his personnel survive a crisis that should have been fatal. All sections report status. Medical teams prepare to assess any personnel who may have been exposed to chemical agents during the initial phases of the attack. Intelligence section coordinate with Colonel Santos for complete tactical assessment. As the immediate crisis subsided, Maria understood that the personal consequences of her decision to implement the Phoenix Protocol countermeasures were only beginning to become apparent. The classified defense systems that had saved Fort Braxton would require investigation by military intelligence agencies that would want to understand how experimental technology had been deployed without proper authorization. Her cover identity as a night shift janitor would be scrutinized by investigators who would demand explanations for capabilities that exceeded anything that civilian personnel should possess. The secure communication device that had provided access to the Phoenix Protocol systems was now displaying priority messages from command authorities who had been monitoring the situation at Fort Braxton. The messages indicated that Maria's actions had been observed by intelligence agencies that were responsible for maintaining the security of classified operations, and that her decision to reveal the base's true capabilities would require extensive debriefing and investigation. "Colonel Santos, we need to discuss the implications of what just happened," Lieutenant Colonel Chen said, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone who was beginning to understand that the woman she had known as a civilian employee was connected to operations that operated at classification levels far above her own clearance. "The technology you just deployed isn't in any manual or database that I've ever seen." Maria nodded once, acknowledging that the time for maintaining her cover identity had passed. The woman who had cleaned floors and emptied trash cans for 18 months was about to become the subject of investigations that would examine every aspect of her background and training. The invisible service that had allowed her to monitor Fort Braxton's vulnerabilities and prepare for threats like the one they had just survived was ending, replaced by the scrutiny that accompanied exposure of classified operations. "Lieutenant Colonel Chen, the Phoenix protocol systems that were deployed tonight represent technology that is years ahead of anything available to conventional military forces," Maria explained, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had accepted the consequences of her actions. "My assignment to Fort Braxton was part of a classified program that places specialized personnel at strategic locations to monitor threats and coordinate responses that exceed standard military capabilities. The revelation that Fort Braxton had been hosting classified operations involving experimental defense technology would have implications that extended far beyond the immediate crisis. The base would become the subject of investigations that would examine every aspect of its operations, and the personnel who had been exposed to the Phoenix protocol systems would require security clearances that would change their careers and personal lives. Maria's decision to save their lives had created consequences that would affect everyone who had witnessed the deployment of classified technology. But as Maria prepared to face the investigations and scrutiny that would follow her exposure, she felt no regret about the choice she had made. The alternative had been allowing everyone at Fort Braxton to die from weapons that conventional military forces couldn't have survived. The oath she had taken years earlier to protect American lives had required her to abandon the invisibility that had protected her, and she had accepted that sacrifice willingly. The woman who had been dismissed as a night shift janitor had revealed capabilities that had saved everyone on the base from an assault that represented the most advanced military technology in the world. The personal cost of that revelation would be measured in years of investigation and the end of a career that had been built on the ability to operate invisibly in environments where her presence was crucial but unrecognized. The aftermath of the Phoenix Protocol deployment brought a parade of investigators, intelligence officers, and military officials to Fort Braxton that transformed the base from a routine military installation into the epicenter of classified briefings and security assessments. Maria spent the first 48 hours following the crisis in continuous debriefing sessions, providing detailed accounts of her 18 months of covert operations to analysts who possessed clearance levels that exceeded most general officers. The small conference room where she had first revealed her identity to Lieutenant Colonel Chen became a secure briefing facility where every aspect of her assignment was examined and documented. The investigation teams that arrived at Fort Braxton represented multiple agencies and departments that were responsible for different aspects of the classified operations that had been conducted at the base. The Defense Intelligence Agency sent specialists who examined the technical aspects of the Phoenix protocol systems and their integration into the base's infrastructure. The Army's Criminal Investigation Division dispatched investigators who reviewed the legal implications of deploying classified technology without proper authorization. Most significantly, representatives from the Special Operations Command arrived to assess the operational security implications of exposing deep cover personnel and experimental defense systems. Maria's debriefing sessions revealed the full scope of the threat assessment that had led to her placement at Fort Braxton. The intelligence agencies had identified the base as a likely target for sophisticated attacks involving experimental weapon systems, and her assignment had been part of a broader program to position specialized personnel at strategic locations where conventional military forces might prove inadequate. The Agent Nemesis attack and the electromagnetic pulse assault had been anticipated, based on intelligence indicators that suggested enemy forces were testing advanced chemical and electronic warfare capabilities. The transformation of Fort Braxton's infrastructure during Maria's 18 months of service had been conducted through a series of maintenance projects and equipment upgrades that appeared routine to the base's official personnel. The electromagnetic hardening systems had been installed during electrical system modernization projects. The chemical neutralization systems had been integrated into the base's air handling equipment during routine maintenance operations. The secure communication networks had been established through telecommunications upgrades that seemed designed to improve standard military communications. Colonel Mitchell found himself at the center of briefings that revealed the true nature of the base he had been commanding for over 2 years. The routine military installation that he had managed according to standard operating procedures had actually been serving as a testing ground for experimental defense technologies that represented the cutting edge of military science. The personnel under his command had been protected by systems that exceeded anything available to conventional military forces, though they had been unaware of the capabilities that surrounded them. The investigation into Maria's background revealed a military career that had been carefully constructed to support deep cover operations in environments where conventional intelligence gathering would be impossible. Her service record showed assignments to locations around the world where she had operated under various cover identities, gathering intelligence about emerging threats and preparing countermeasures for attacks that conventional military forces wouldn't be able to survive. The janitorial position at Fort Braxton had been one of many roles she had assumed during a career that had been dedicated to protecting American military personnel from threats they didn't know existed. Lieutenant Colonel Chen's debriefing sessions focused on her observations of Maria's behavior during the 18 months preceding the crisis. The investigators were particularly interested in her assessment of how effectively Maria had maintained her cover identity while conducting surveillance of the base's vulnerabilities. Chen's reports described a civilian employee who had been unremarkable in every way, whose presence had been so invisible that most personnel couldn't recall specific interactions with her, despite seeing her regularly during shift changes. Base's personnel were required to undergo security briefings that explained the classified nature of the operations they had witnessed during the crisis. The Phoenix Protocol deployment had exposed them to technology that was years ahead of publicly acknowledged military capabilities, creating security obligations that would affect their careers and personal lives for years to come. The briefings emphasized that their knowledge of the experimental defense systems was classified at levels that required them to maintain absolute secrecy about what they had observed. Maria's living quarters were subjected to detailed forensic examination that revealed the sophisticated counter-surveillance measures she had employed to maintain her cover identity. The investigators found evidence of monitoring equipment that had been used to track base personnel and identify potential security threats. The apartment that had appeared to be the modest home of a civilian employee had actually been an operational safe house equipped with communication systems and intelligence gathering equipment that exceeded anything available to conventional military units. The secure communication device that Maria had used to access the Phoenix Protocol systems was analyzed by technical specialists who were amazed by the sophistication of the classified networks that had been accessible to deep cover personnel. The device had provided real-time access to intelligence databases that contained information about experimental weapons systems and advanced countermeasures that were still in development phases. The communication capabilities had enabled Maria to coordinate with command authorities who operated at classification levels that exceeded most senior military officers. The investigation also examined the broader implications of deploying experimental defense technology at a military installation without the knowledge of its commanding officer. The Phoenix Protocol systems had been installed and maintained by personnel who operated under cover identities similar to Maria's, creating a shadow infrastructure that had protected Fort Braxton from threats that conventional military forces couldn't have survived. The ethical and legal questions raised by operating classified defense systems without proper authorization would require policy decisions at the highest levels of government. Maria's performance during the crisis was evaluated by military professionals who specialized in chemical warfare and electronic countermeasures. Their assessment concluded that her actions had been essential to the survival of everyone at Fort Braxton, and that conventional military response procedures would have been completely inadequate to address the sophisticated nature of the attack. The Agent Nemesis, chemical assault, and the electromagnetic pulse weapons had been specifically designed to overwhelm standard military defenses, and only the experimental countermeasures that Maria had deployed had been effective against the Jigu. Advanced threat systems. The base's medical personnel were debriefed about their observations of Maria's treatment of casualties during the Agent Nemesis attack. Their reports described medical procedures that had exceeded anything they had been trained to perform, with techniques that had been effective against chemical agents that weren't found in standard military medical databases. The investigators were particularly interested in Maria's knowledge of specific antidotes and treatment protocols that had been classified at levels that exceeded the clearance of most medical personnel. The investigation teams concluded that Maria's assignment to Fort Braxton had been successful in achieving its primary objectives. The base's vulnerabilities had been assessed and addressed through the installation of experimental defense systems that had proven effective against the most sophisticated threats that enemy forces could deploy. The intelligence gathered during her 18 months of covert operations had provided valuable information about emerging threats and the effectiveness of advanced countermeasures that would be crucial for protecting other military installations. As the formal investigation process concluded, Maria was informed that her deep cover assignment had been terminated and that she would be transferred to a position that would utilize her specialized skills in a more conventional military role. The Phoenix Protocol deployment had ended any possibility of returning to covert operations, as her identity and capabilities were now known to too many people to maintain the invisibility that deep cover work required. The official recognition of Maria's actions took the form of classified commendations that would never appear in public records, but would be noted in the restricted files that documented the most sensitive military operations. The lives she had saved at Fort Braxton would be remembered by the personnel who had witnessed her transformation from invisible janitor to the specialist who had coordinated their defense against weapons that conventional military forces couldn't have survived. The woman who had cleaned floors and emptied trash cans for 18 months had completed her assignment by revealing capabilities that had saved everyone at the base from an assault that represented the most advanced military technology in the world. The personal cost of that revelation would be measured in the end of a career that had been built on the ability to operate invisibly. But the alternative had been allowing American military personnel to die from threats that only she had been trained to counter. 6 months after the Phoenix Protocol deployment, Colonel Maria Santos stood in the briefing room of the Pentagon's Special Operations Research Division, wearing the dress uniform that displayed ribbons and decorations that told only part of the story of her 22 years of military service. The position she now held carried the official title of Senior Chemical Warfare Specialist, but her actual responsibilities involved developing countermeasures for threats that conventional military forces weren't equipped to handle. The office she had been assigned was larger than the janitor's closet where she had stored her cleaning supplies at Fort Braxton, But she missed the simplicity of work that could be measured in clean floors and empty trash cans. The briefing she was conducting involved senior military officials who possessed clearance levels that allowed them to hear about experimental weapon systems and advanced countermeasures that were being developed to protect American military installations from sophisticated attacks. The audience included generals and admirals who had spent their careers managing conventional military operations, but who now needed to understand threats that required responses beyond standard military capabilities. Maria's presentation covered the lessons learned from the Fort Braxton incident and the implications for defending other strategic installations. The analysis of the Agent Nemesis attack had revealed that enemy forces possessed detailed intelligence about American military installations that exceeded anything that had been anticipated by conventional security assessments. The chemical weapons and electromagnetic pulse systems that had been deployed against Fort Braxton represented technology that was years ahead of what intelligence agencies had predicted enemy forces would be capable of developing. The sophistication of the attack had demonstrated the need for defensive capabilities that operated beyond the boundaries of conventional military doctrine. Maria's recommendations for protecting other military installations involved the deployment of experimental defense systems similar to those that had been installed at Fort Braxton during her 18 months of covert service. The Phoenix Protocol technology had proven effective against the most advanced threats that enemy forces could deploy, but implementing these systems required personnel who possessed specialized training and security clearances that exceeded what most military personnel would ever obtain. The program would require expanding the network of deep cover specialists who could operate invisibly within military installations while preparing for threats that conventional forces couldn't survive. The cost of expanding the deep cover program would be measured not only in financial resources but in the personal sacrifices required from personnel who would spend years operating under false identities in environments where their true capabilities couldn't be acknowledged. Maria's own experience had demonstrated that deep cover assignments required individuals who could maintain psychological stability while living lives that were fundamentally disconnected from their actual training and expertise. The isolation and invisibility that were essential for operational security created personal costs that were difficult to quantify but significant to the people who bore them. The personnel who had been at Fort Braxton during the crisis had been transferred to positions that utilized their exposure to classified technology while maintaining the security requirements that their knowledge created. Lieutenant Colonel Chen had been promoted to colonel and assigned to a position that involved coordinating security for other installations that might be targeted for similar attacks. The medical personnel who had observed Maria's treatment of chemical casualties had been given advanced training in countermeasures for exotic chemical agents, though they would never again encounter anything as sophisticated as Agent Nemesis. Sergeant Williams, the guard who had initially dismissed Maria's attempts to provide assistance during the crisis, had been selected for specialized training in recognizing personnel who might possess capabilities beyond their apparent positions. The lesson that appearances could be deceiving had been reinforced through case studies that emphasized the importance of remaining open to expertise that might exist in unexpected places. His experience with Maria had become part of the training curriculum for security personnel who might encounter similar situations in the future. The base personnel who had been evacuated during the Phoenix Protocol deployment had been debriefed about their observations of the experimental technology, but they were prohibited from discussing their experiences with anyone who didn't possess appropriate security clearances. The knowledge they had gained about advanced defense systems would remain classified for decades, creating a shared experience that bound them together while separating them from colleagues who hadn't been exposed to similar operations. Colonel Mitchell had been promoted to brigadier general and assigned to a position that involved overseeing the installation of experimental defense systems at other strategic locations. His experience with the Phoenix Protocol deployment had provided him with insights into the challenges of commanding installations that hosted classified operations without the knowledge of their official leadership. The administrative and ethical complexities of managing dual-purpose facilities required skills that weren't covered in standard military leadership training. The apartment complex where Maria had lived during her assignment to Fort Braxton had been subjected to security assessments that revealed the sophisticated counter-surveillance measures she had employed to maintain her cover identity. The other residents had been questioned about their interactions with her, but their responses confirmed that she had been successful in creating the impression of an unremarkable civilian employee whose life revolved around her work schedule and little else. The investigators found no evidence that anyone had suspected her true identity or capabilities. The official records of the Fort Braxton incident had been classified at levels that would prevent public disclosure for decades, but the personnel who had witnessed Maria's actions would carry the memory of her transformation from invisible janitor to the specialist who had saved their lives. The story would be passed down through informal networks of military personnel who understood the importance of recognizing capability that might exist in unexpected places. The lesson that heroes sometimes wore janitors' uniforms would become part of military culture in ways that official recognition could never achieve. Maria's new position allowed her to work openly with the technology and expertise that she had been forced to conceal during her deep cover assignments. The laboratory where she developed countermeasures for exotic chemical weapons was equipped with resources that exceeded anything available to conventional military facilities. The researchers who worked with her possessed knowledge of threats and defensive systems that represented the cutting edge of military science, but they also understood the personal costs that came with protecting people who would never know their names or acknowledge their contributions. The secure communication networks that had enabled Maria to coordinate the Phoenix Protocol deployment continued to connect deep cover specialists who were positioned at strategic locations around the world. The encrypted channels carried reports from personnel who operated under cover identities, similar to the one Maria had maintained at Fort Braxton, gathering intelligence about emerging threats and preparing countermeasures for attacks that conventional military forces wouldn't be able to survive. The network represented a shadow infrastructure that protected American military personnel from dangers they didn't know existed. The training programs that prepared personnel for deep cover assignments emphasized the psychological challenges of maintaining false identities while possessing capabilities that exceeded those of the people around them. The curriculum included case studies of successful operations, including Maria's experience at Fort Braxton, that demonstrated the importance of patience and invisibility in gathering intelligence about vulnerabilities that might be exploited by sophisticated enemy forces. The programs also addressed the personal costs of service that couldn't be officially acknowledged or rewarded through conventional military recognition systems. Maria's reflection on her 18 months as a night shift janitor at Fort Braxton focused on the satisfaction that came from knowing that her invisible service had prepared her to save lives when the moment of crisis arrived. The cleaning supplies and maintenance equipment that had provided her cover had been tools that enabled her to gather intelligence about vulnerabilities that conventional security assessments would have missed. The unremarkable efficiency that had characterized her work had been the foundation for operational capabilities that had proven essential when sophisticated threats materialized. The oath that Maria had taken when she first joined the military had required her to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The commitment hadn't specified that her service would be acknowledged or rewarded through conventional channels, only that she would be ready to act when American lives were at stake. The 18 months of invisibility at Fort Braxton had been preparation for a moment when her specialized training would be the difference between life and death for people who had dismissed her as an as a shampoo. unremarkable civilian employee. The woman who had cleaned floors and emptied trash cans had fulfilled her oath by revealing capabilities that saved everyone at Fort Braxton from weapons that conventional military forces couldn't have survived. The personal cost of that revelation had been measured in the end of a career built on invisibility. But the alternative had been allowing the American military personnel to die from threats that only she had been trained to counter. Some promises were worth keeping regardless of the personal cost, and some sacrifices were worth making even when they would never be officially acknowledged. That the true measure of Maria's service wouldn't be found in the classified commendations that recorded her actions or the advanced position that recognized her expertise. It would be measured in the lives of people who continued to breathe because someone had been willing to spend 18 months cleaning floors while preparing to reveal capabilities that would save them from threats they couldn't have imagined. Sometimes the most important work happened in the shadows, done by people whose names would never appear in headlines, but whose actions made all the difference when it mattered most. 2 years later, Maria Santos walked through the corridors of a small military hospital in Germany, her footsteps echoing softly against polished floors that reminded her of Fort Braxton. But this time, she wore the uniform of a colonel, with ribbons that told a story only a few people were authorized to understand. Her new assignment involved training the next generation of deep cover specialists, teaching them the patience and invisibility that had enabled her to save lives when conventional military solutions failed. The young soldiers in her training program listened intently as she shared the lessons learned from 18 months of cleaning floors while preparing for threats that most people couldn't imagine. She taught them that true service sometimes meant being dismissed and ignored, that the most important work often happened in the shadows, and that heroes didn't always wear the uniforms that revealed their capabilities. In her office, Maria kept a single reminder of her time at Fort Braxton, a worn cleaning cloth that she had used during her first night shift at the base. It served as a reminder that appearances could be deceiving, that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary actions, and that the most important contributions to national security sometimes came from those who remained invisible until the moment when their expertise was the difference between life and death. The oath she had taken 24 years earlier continued to guide her service, even as the nature of that service evolved. Some promises didn't come with expiration dates, and some commitments transcended the boundaries of official recognition or public acknowledgement. What did you think of Maria's incredible journey from invisible janitor to the specialist who saved an entire military base? Stories like these remind us that heroes walk among us every day, often in the most unexpected places. If you enjoyed this tale of hidden courage and sacrifice, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join our community of storytellers. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever encountered someone whose true capabilities surprised you? Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest inspiring stories about everyday heroes doing extraordinary things.